A daughter stands alone at her PhD graduation, clutching a degree her father called worthless paper, while he's miles away celebrating a grease-stained promotion for his favorite son. He thought he could ignore her success forever, but he never imagined those worthless skills would be the very thing to expose the poison hidden inside his family empire. I hope you're all having a peaceful week, perhaps enjoying a quiet cup of tea while the wind blows outside. I've been reading your messages about toxic family loyalty, and it reminded me so much of the story I'm about to share. It's a story that asks us, what do we owe to those who gave us life but refuse to give us respect? Let's step into the shoes of Elena Thorne and see why she had to burn the bridge to save the village. The scarlet robes of Harvard felt heavy, like a suit of armor I had spent 7 years forging, only to realize I was standing on a battlefield entirely alone. Around me, the air in Tercentenary Theater was thick with the scent of old brick, blooming magnolias, and the deafening roar of thousands of families celebrating their children's triumphs. But my phone, vibrating with a cold, insistent rhythm in my palm, held a different kind of noise. When I finally pressed it to my ear, I didn't hear a "congratulations" or "we are proud of you." Instead, the sound of a cheering crowd erupted through the speaker, followed by the sharp, metallic clang of a spatula hitting a flat-top grill. My father's voice, Arthur Vance, cut through the celebration like a butcher's knife through sinew, loud and abrasive, drowning out the commencement speaker's words about the future. He wasn't at my graduation. He was at a parking lot in Houston, standing on a makeshift stage for the grand reopening of the flagship Vance's Heritage Grill. "Evelyn, where the hell are the extra aprons?" Arthur shouted, his voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing authority that had dictated the first 28 years of my life. I stood there, a doctor of epidemiology, surrounded by the brightest minds in the country, and my father was asking me about laundry. I didn't answer immediately. I practiced the silence of the abyss, letting his anger echo in the vacuum of my restraint. I could hear Caleb, my younger brother, in the background, probably fumbling with a ribbon-cutting ceremony he hadn't earned. Arthur didn't even wait for me to speak before he continued his assault. He told me that while I was wasting my time and his hard-earned money on useless books and fancy titles, the real world was happening back home in Texas. He called my PhD a vanity project, a piece of expensive paper that wouldn't help me chop meat or manage a single one of his kitchen lines. He was so certain of my insignificance that he didn't even realize he was speaking to a woman who had just been recruited by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. To him, I was just the daughter who had failed her primary duty, being a subservient cog in the Vance machine. The irony was as sharp as a chef's steel. My father had spent his entire life building a heritage based on the idea of the American dream: hard work, family loyalty, and the sanctity of a man's word. Yet, as I looked at my diploma, the ink barely dry, I realized his version of the dream was a nightmare of narcissism. He had forced the entire family to skip my ceremony to serve as props for Caleb's ascension as the chosen successor. He had traded my milestone for a publicity stunt. Through the phone, I heard him tell a local reporter that the Vance family was all here, standing together, a lie so casual it made my skin crawl. He wasn't just dismissing my achievement. He was erasing my existence from the family narrative because I had dared to value my own intellect over his ego. He into the receiver, a jagged, self-satisfied sound, and told me to quit playing dress-up in that silly robe and get on a flight back to Houston by 8 o'clock because they were short-staffed for the dinner rush. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere between my master's thesis and my 3rd year of clinical rotations. Instead, I felt a profound sense of fracture, a clean, surgical break from the person I was supposed to be. I looked down at the gold signet ring on my right hand, embossed with the Vance family crest, a symbol of a legacy that felt increasingly like a shackle. For years, I had worn it as a badge of belonging, hoping that one day Arthur would see me as an equal, a partner, a daughter worthy of his respect. But as he continued to drone on about the uselessness of my education, I realized that Arthur Vance didn't want a daughter. He wanted a servant who shared his DNA. He viewed my pursuit of science as a betrayal of his grill smoke empire. In his mind, my ability to track pathogens was nothing compared to Caleb's ability to charm a group of local investors with a practiced smile and a plate of mediocre brisket. "Are you even listening, Evelyn?" he barked, his patience thinning. I remained silent, watching a fellow graduate hug her father just a few feet away, the man's face beaming with a pride that Arthur would never be capable of feeling for anyone but himself. I finally spoke, my voice low and steady, lacking any of the heat he expected. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for his approval. I simply told him that Evelyn was no longer available for the dinner shift. I hung up the phone before he could respond with another insult, the silence that followed being the most honest conversation we had ever had. I walked away from the ceremony, ignoring the calls from my mother that began to flood in minutes later. I went back to my small apartment, took a plain manila envelope, and slid the gold signet ring inside. I didn't write a long letter of grievance. I simply addressed it to the Vance's Heritage Grill headquarters with no return address. Evelyn Vance was dead to them, buried under the weight of their own arrogance. As I sealed the envelope, I felt the first breath of true air I had taken in a decade. I was no longer a Vance. I was Elena Thorne, and I was about to become the one thing my father feared more than a failing business: the person who knew exactly what was rotting inside his kitchen. The phantom weight of the signet ring lingered on my finger, a cold reminder of the skin I had finally shed. Sitting in the sudden, ringing silence of my apartment, I looked down at my hands that now held the credentials of a scientist, yet in the dim light, they still felt like the hands of a 12-year-old girl covered in the permanent yellowed film of industrial fryer grease. My mind drifted back to the sweltering July of my youth in Houston, where the Texas sun hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the original Heritage Grill until the kitchen felt like the inside of a furnace. While other girls my age were at summer camps or lounging by neighborhood pools, I was the invisible engine of my father's ambition. I remember the stinging heat of the dishwater, always a few degrees too hot, and the way the caustic soap turned my knuckles into a map of raw, red fissures. Arthur called it character building, his favorite euphemism for free labor. He would stand at the pass-through window, his face flushed from the heat of the grill and the glow of his own self-importance, barking orders at me as if I were a stray dog he had done a favor by taking in. The hierarchy of the Vance household was etched into the very floorboards of that restaurant. Caleb, my younger brother, was the golden prince, usually found in the air-conditioned sanctuary of the front office or studying the art of hospitality by charm offensive in the regular customers. He was the one Arthur sent to the expensive private academy across town, a place where the tuition was paid for in my sweat and the literal skin of my palms. I was the kitchen girl, the one who stayed until 2 a.m, scrubbing the blackened carbon off the grates because my father refused to hire a professional cleaning crew. "Why pay a stranger when I have a perfectly capable daughter?" he would say, his voice booming with a fake joviality that never reached his eyes. He viewed my labor as his birthright, a natural tax I owed for the privilege of carrying his name. Every dollar I saved him was a dollar that went into Caleb's baseball camps or Caleb's new car. It was my first lesson in the American dream as interpreted by Arthur Vance. It wasn't about working hard to rise. It was about making sure the right people rose on the backs of the ones who were expected to stay silent. I can still see my mother, Martha, hovering in the periphery like a ghost caught in the crossfire. She would occasionally press a cold, damp cloth to the back of my neck when Arthur wasn't looking, her eyes filled with a quiet, useless pity. She never stood up to him. She never told him that a young girl shouldn't be hauling 40-pound bags of onions or degreasing vents in the middle of the night. In her world, Arthur was the sun, and we were just satellites lucky enough to stay in his orbit. The silence of the women in our family was the glue that held the Vance empire together. I remember one night, after a particularly brutal double shift, I asked my father if I could use some of the tips I'd managed to hide to buy a secondhand microscope I'd seen at a garage sale. He laughed so hard he nearly choked on his cigar, telling me that girls like me didn't need to look at microbes. We just needed to make sure the customers didn't see the dirt under our fingernails. That laugh was the first time I felt the silence of the abyss beginning to form inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just went back to the sink and scrubbed until my hands bled. That microscope became my secret rebellion. I bought it eventually, hiding it under my bed like contraband. While Caleb was out failing his business classes and getting his 3rd speeding ticket, I was staying up until dawn, fascinated by the invisible worlds I found in drops of stagnant water or scrapings from the very kitchen tiles I cleaned by day. I realized then that while my father could control my body and my time, he couldn't touch my mind. He thought he was breaking me, molding me into a permanent servant of the grill, but he was actually sharpening me into a weapon. Every insult he threw at my useless books was just more fuel for the fire that was burning away the Evelyn Vance he thought he knew. I learned to observe, to analyze, and to wait. I learned that even the largest empires can be brought down by the smallest, most invisible things if they are allowed to rot from the inside out. The memory of that old kitchen bell, that sharp, demanding ding that used to make my heart race with anxiety, suddenly echoed in my mind. But as I blinked back to the present, it transformed into the crisp digital ping of my laptop. The screen glowed with a new notification from the public health surveillance system I now managed as Elena Thorne. I wasn't that girl in the grease-stained apron anymore. I was a doctor of epidemiology, a woman trained to find the hidden threats that others were too arrogant or too blind to see. As I opened the file, a familiar name caught my eye, sending a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in my Boston apartment. A cluster of gastrointestinal illnesses had been reported in a concentrated area of North Texas, all linked by one common denominator. My hands, no longer red or raw, moved with a cold, scientific precision over the keyboard. The past was calling, but this time, I wasn't the one who would be taking orders. The kitchen girl was gone, and in her place stood the person who was about to dismantle the very heritage my father had built on a foundation of lies and labor. The data on my screen was a cold, clinical language of numbers, but as an epidemiologist, I knew how to translate those digits into human suffering. A statistical anomaly had flared up on the map of North Texas, a cluster of 24 cases of severe gastrointestinal distress, all reported within a 10-day window. The symptoms described in the clinical reports were consistent: hemorrhagic colitis, the hallmark of a virulent strain of E. coli. As I cross-referenced the patient interviews, a name began to surface with sickening regularity, like a buoy rising through murky water. Every single victim had eaten at a Vance's Heritage Grill location within the 72 hours preceding their first symptoms. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight back to the house I had burned down in my heart only months ago. While my colleagues saw a routine investigation, I saw a legacy of negligence finally catching up with the man who claimed his word was his bond. I didn't report it to my superiors immediately. Instead, I took a week of accumulated leave, packed a bag with my diagnostic kit and a pair of nondescript glasses, and flew back to the heat of Texas. I wasn't going home as a daughter. I was going as a predator of pathogens, a silent observer in a world that had forgotten I existed. The flagship restaurant in Houston looked exactly the same from the outside, a sprawling, rustic monument to Texas tradition with its cedar siding and neon Longhorn sign. But as I sat in the corner booth of the dimly lit dining room, nursing a glass of iced tea I had no intention of drinking, my trained eyes saw the red flags Arthur Vance had taught me to ignore as a child. The air felt heavy, the humidity inside the building too high, a sign that the industrial HVAC system was struggling. I watched the servers, most of them looking exhausted and disheveled, their uniforms stained with more than just a day's work. They were moving with a frantic, disorganized energy that suggested a kitchen in crisis. When a plate of the famous Heritage brisket was delivered to a nearby table, the scent that reached me wasn't the clean, smoky aroma of hickory-cured meat. There was an undercurrent of something sharp and sour, masked heavily by an aggressive amount of black pepper and vinegar-based mop sauce. It was a smell I knew well from the summers I spent scrubbing the walk-in freezers. The smell of meat that was on the verge of turning, being saved by a cook who cared more about the bottom line than the customer's health. Under the cover of a busy dinner rush, I slipped through the hallway toward the restrooms and took a sharp left through the swinging double doors I had pushed 10,000 times before. The staff was too occupied with a shouting match near the pass-through to notice a woman in a plain gray blazer and glasses. I moved toward the prep station in the back, the invisible observer I had spent 20 years perfecting. There, under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights, I saw Caleb. He didn't look like the golden prince from the newspaper clippings. His face was slick with sweat, his expensive silk tie tucked into a grease-stained apron, and his hands that had never known a day of real labor, were frantically dumping a gallon-sized container of a dark, spicy rub into a stainless steel vat of grayish, pre-cooked meat. The meat looked dull and slimy, clearly having sat at room temperature for far too long. He was washing the rot away, a technique Arthur used to joke was the Vance secret to high margins. I felt a wave of visceral disgust, not just for the act itself, but for the sheer, lazy incompetence of it. Caleb wasn't just cutting corners. He was playing Russian roulette with the lives of every person sitting in that dining room, and he was too arrogant to even realize the gun was loaded. I stepped further into the shadows of the dry storage area, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, cold fury. That was when I saw her. My mother, Martha, was standing near the industrial walk-in freezer, her small frame looking fragile against the heavy steel door. She wasn't helping Caleb, but she wasn't stopping him either. She just stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the floor as Caleb barked an order at a young busboy to get this out to the line, now. She had always been the silent witness to Arthur's small cruelties, but this was different. This wasn't about a missed graduation or a broken spirit. This was about a physical threat to the community that had built their empire. I watched her look up for a brief second, her eyes meeting Caleb's, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in her expression. She knew exactly what was in that vat. She knew the refrigeration system was failing. She knew the meat was tainted, and she was choosing to stay silent to protect the Vance name. In that moment, the last thread of sentimentality I held for my family snapped. I realized that the rot wasn't just in the kitchen. It was in the very blood that ran through their veins. I turned away before she could see me, my mind already calculating the biological half-life of the bacteria I had just witnessed being served. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was the prosecution. I had barely made it back to my motel room, the sterile smell of the hospital-grade disinfectant I'd used to scrub my arms still clinging to my skin, when my phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. The caller ID didn't say Mom. It said Martha Vance, a name that now felt like a relic from a previous life. I stared at it for 3 long rings, wondering if she had seen me in the shadows of the kitchen, or if she simply sensed the storm I was about to unleash. When I finally answered, there was no warmth, no inquiry about my life in Boston or how my career was flourishing. Instead, her voice was a fragile, high-pitched warble, the sound of a woman who had spent 40 years polishing the edges of a monster's ego. She didn't ask how I was. She asked me what I had done. She told me she knew I was back in Texas, that Caleb had seen someone who looked like Evelyn lurking near the dumpsters. The irony was almost physical. They only recognized me when they feared I might be a threat to their sanctuary of grease and secrets. "Evelyn, honey," she started, using that soft, manipulative tone that used to make me feel guilty for existing. I didn't correct her on the name. I just listened, practicing the silence of the abyss that I had learned from her, letting her own anxiety fill the space between us. She began to plead, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. She admitted, in a whisper so low it was almost a confession, that they knew the refrigeration system in the North Texas warehouse had failed 4 days ago. She knew the meat Caleb was processing was tainted. But then came the toxic hook, the plea for my silence. She told me that Arthur was fragile, that his heart couldn't take a scandal right now with the 25th anniversary gala and the new branch opening in Dallas just 2 weeks away. She spoke about the Vance legacy as if it were a holy relic, something that deserved to be protected at the cost of human lives. It was the ultimate betrayal of the American dream they claimed to uphold. They had replaced hard work and integrity with a desperate, hollow vanity. I sat on the edge of the bed, the flickering neon sign from the parking lot casting a harsh blue light over my hands. I felt a wave of profound disappointment that washed away the last remnants of my childhood affection. My mother was asking me to be an accomplice to a crime. She was choosing the face of the family, the public image of a successful Texas dynasty, over the reality of the children and elderly people who were currently lying in hospital beds because of Caleb's negligence. She told me that if the health department shut them down now, Arthur would be ruined, and Caleb's future as the successor would be vaporized. She actually had the audacity to suggest that because I was a doctor, I should understand that accidents happen, and that I should use my connections to make the reports disappear. It was a slap in the face to everything I had studied for, every late night I had spent over a microscope, and every value of responsibility I had ever held. The sarcasm bubbled up in my throat, a bitter brew of resentment and clarity. I told her that it was fascinating how she suddenly remembered I had connections and a professional title when it served the family business, yet only 6 months ago, those same things were considered useless books. I asked her if she had visited the ICU in Arlington, if she had seen the 6-year-old boy who was on a ventilator because of a Vance brisket sandwich. Her silence on the other end was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of regret. It was the silence of a woman who had decided that certain lives were simply the cost of doing business. She told me I was being dramatic and that I was acting out because I was still angry about the graduation. She reduced a public health catastrophe to a sibling rivalry, a petty grudge from a daughter she never truly tried to understand. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her excuses like a scalpel. "You aren't asking me to save the family. You're asking me to help you bury the bodies." I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the sound of a woman who had finally realized that the kitchen girl was gone forever. She tried one last time, invoking the memory of the hard work Arthur had put in to build this empire, the tilling of the soil that had provided for us. But I wasn't that little girl in the grease-stained apron anymore. I told her that a real legacy is built on the truth, not on the ability to hide a pile of rotting meat behind a shiny Longhorn sign. The conversation ended not with a goodbye, but with a cold, final realization. I told her, "Mom, I save people. I don't save lies." As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of peace. The umbilical cord of toxic loyalty had been severed. I wasn't just Elena Thorne, the scientist. I was Elena Thorne, the reckoning. The heavy mahogany doors of the Vance's Heritage Grill headquarters were more than just an entrance. They were a barrier intended to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the king in his castle. I walked through the executive lobby, my footsteps muffled by the thick, plush carpet that smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and the faint, lingering scent of hickory smoke from the test kitchens below. The receptionist, a woman who had worked for my father for 20 years, didn't even look up as I passed, her eyes fixed on a glowing monitor. She didn't recognize me as the kitchen girl or the daughter who had supposedly gone astray. I was just another anonymous visitor in a sharp blazer and sensible shoes. I pushed open the double doors to Arthur's private sanctuary without knocking, the sudden light from the floor-to-ceiling windows momentarily blinding me. Arthur was seated behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single, massive oak tree, a throne for a man who believed he was the architect of the very ground we stood on. He didn't look up from his ledger, but the air in the room shifted, growing heavy with the silence of the abyss that I had come to know so well. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in my chest. He didn't offer a seat or a greeting. He simply set his gold-plated fountain pen down with a deliberate click. "Your mother said you were being hysterical on the phone. I assumed you'd come here to apologize for that little stunt at the motel." I didn't respond immediately, letting his words hang in the air like smoke in a stagnant room. I stood there, perfectly still, watching him. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, his skin more sallow, but his eyes were still filled with that terrifying, unearned arrogance. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin blue folder, the preliminary report from the CDC's regional lab. I placed it on the edge of his desk, the paper a stark, clinical white against the dark wood. I told him, my voice steady and devoid of the heat he was expecting, that there were 24 confirmed cases of E. coli linked to his flagship location. I explained the technical reality of the situation. The bacteria count in the samples was nearly 10 times the legal limit, and the strain was virulent enough to cause permanent kidney failure in children. Arthur didn't even open the folder. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, patronizing smile spreading across his face as he looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. He called me a little girl playing scientist, telling me that he had been in the food business since before I was a thought in my mother's head. He claimed that a few stomach aches were just the price of a busy season, and that people in Texas had stronger guts than the pampered academics I spent my time with in Boston. When I pressed him about the failing refrigeration in the warehouse, his tone shifted from mockery to a sharp, jagged anger. He accused me of being bitter and jealous of Caleb's success, claiming that I was trying to sabotage the family name because I couldn't handle being the one left behind. He stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow over me, and told me that the Vance name was a sacred heritage built on hard work and loyalty, something I had supposedly abandoned the moment I chose useless books over his kitchen. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, like the metallic tang of blood in the back of my throat. He was talking about loyalty while he knowingly prepared to poison the very community that had bought him that mahogany desk and that gold fountain pen. My internal monologue was a bitter, mocking commentary on his ego. I realized that to Arthur, a legacy wasn't something you left for the next generation. It was a shield you used to hide your own crimes. I told him that I wasn't there as his daughter, and I wasn't there to settle a childhood grudge. I was there as a public health official, giving him a final opportunity to voluntarily suspend operations and recall the tainted product before the state authorities intervened. It was a lifeline I was throwing to a man who had spent his life trying to drown me. But Arthur Vance didn't know how to take a hand. He only knew how to slap it away. He stepped around the desk, his face flushed a deep, dangerous red, and pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "Get out," he hissed, the word dripping with the venom that no longer had the power to hurt me. "You aren't a Vance. You're a traitor who's forgotten where she came from. You think those fancy degrees make you better than me? You're nothing without this name, and I'm taking it back." I looked at him one last time, feeling a profound sense of closure that settled over me like a cooling fog. I had done my duty. I had offered him the truth, and he had chosen the lie. I had done everything a daughter could be expected to do, and more than he deserved. As I turned to leave, I reached into my pocket and subtly pressed the stop button on the digital recorder I had started the moment I entered the building. I had captured every word of his admission, every laugh at the suffering of his customers, and every insult directed at the truth. I stopped at the door, looking back at the man who thought he had just won a victory. "This was your choice, Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. And choices have a way of becoming their own kind of heritage. I walked out of that office, leaving the echo of his arrogance behind me, ready to turn his own words into the very weapon that would dismantle his empire. I didn't have to wait long for the backfire. I had barely stepped back into the sterile, humming environment of my temporary office at the Regional Public Health Center when my supervisor, Dr. Eris Henderson, called me into his office. The atmosphere was thick with a tension I recognized instantly, the kind of professional chill that precedes a public execution. Dr. Henderson, a man whose integrity I had respected for 5 years, wouldn't even look me in the eye. He sat behind a desk cluttered with printouts of emails and screenshots from the Lone Star Pitmasters, one of the most influential culinary forums in Texas. The allegations were as creative as they were malicious. An anonymous whistleblower had filed a formal complaint with the board, claiming that I, Elena Thorne, was using proprietary CDC surveillance data to extort a beloved Texas institution over a supposed personal vendetta. Arthur had moved fast, leveraging his old boy network of lobbyists and media contacts to paint me as a disgruntled daughter who had failed her family and was now trying to burn it all down with fake science. The smear campaign was surgical in its cruelty. It didn't just target my professional ethics, it targeted my identity. They had dug up a photo of me from a decade ago, looking tired and disheveled in my grease-stained apron, and paired it with a recent shot of me in my doctoral robes. The caption on the food blog suggested that I was playing doctor to exact revenge on a father who had only tried to teach me the value of $1. Arthur was using the very thing I had sacrificed my youth to escape, the Vance heritage, as a cudgel to shatter the new life I had built. Dr. Henderson leaned forward, his voice a low, disappointed rasp. He told me that while the data showed a clear outbreak, my familial connection and the accusations of blackmail had compromised the entire investigation. I was being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of the abyss this time. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut around my ankles. Arthur thought he had won. He thought he could pull a few strings in Austin and Houston and make me disappear back into the shadows of his kitchen. But as I packed my laptop and the few personal items I had on my desk, I didn't feel the panic they expected. I felt a cold, analytical clarity. My father had made a fatal mistake, one born of the very arrogance that had defined his life. He truly believed that I was just a girl who read too many useless books. He had forgotten that before I was an epidemiologist, I was the one who had built his original inventory system. I was the 15-year-old girl who had taught myself to code in the basement of the flagship restaurant because I was tired of handwriting delivery logs. Arthur and Caleb viewed technology as a tool for vanity and marketing, but to me, it was a map. I sat in my motel room that night, the blue light of my screen reflecting in my glasses, and I began to dig. If they were going to accuse me of using data illegally, I was going to show them exactly what data really looked like in the hands of someone who actually understood it. I started with the headers of the anonymous emails sent to the board and Dr. Henderson. It was almost insulting how easy it was. Caleb, in his rush to please Arthur and play the hero, hadn't even bothered to use a VPN or a public network. He had sent the complaints from the executive suite at Vance's Heritage Grill, using the same IP address I had assigned to that office 13 years ago. I traced the metadata of the leaked photos. They were taken on Caleb's latest model smartphone, geotagged to the corporate headquarters. As I watched the digital trail unfold, I felt a sense of intellectual satisfaction that was almost medicinal. They were so blinded by their own self-importance that they left a digital footprint the size of a Texas Longhorn. They thought they were playing a game of chess against a pawn, but they didn't realize I had already mapped the entire board before they even made their first move. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing the timestamps of the smear posts with the corporate login logs I still had access to. A security loophole Arthur had never bothered to close because he considered IT stuff beneath him. I saw exactly when Caleb had logged into the forum to post the anonymous tips. I saw the drafts of the emails being traded between my father's assistant and a local PR firm. It was a masterpiece of incompetence. They weren't just attacking me. They were documenting their own conspiracy to obstruct a federal health investigation. My internal monologue was a sharp, mocking whisper in the dark. "Oh, Arthur, you think you're a king. But you're just a man who forgot to change his passwords." I compiled every screenshot, every IP log, and every string of metadata into a secured, encrypted file. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I discovered a hidden folder in the shared drive, one Caleb had titled Insurance. It contains the unedited refrigeration logs from the Dallas warehouse, the ones they had tried to wipe from the main system. It showed the temperature spiking to 60 degrees for over 48 hours. They hadn't just accidentally served bad meat. They had documented the failure and then decided to serve it anyway to avoid a loss of $50,000. I stared at the numbers on the screen, feeling the weight of their negligence like a physical pressure. Arthur and Caleb had spent the last 48 hours trying to destroy my career to protect their pride, while people were literally dying from their choices. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a surgeon about to make the first cut in a very necessary operation. I didn't call Dr. Henderson back. I didn't plead with the board. I didn't respond to the trolls on the forums. I simply looked at the file on my desktop, which I had renamed the Vance Audit. My father had spent my entire childhood telling me that I was nothing without his name. He was right about one thing. The name Vance was about to become nothing. But not because of me. It was because he and Caleb had built a legacy out of rot, and expected it to hold up under the light of the truth. I closed my laptop with a quiet, satisfying click. I was Elena Thorne, and while they were busy playing with fire in the front of the house, I was the one who knew exactly where the gas lines were buried. I was ready for the next phase. It was time to put a face to the numbers I had been tracking, and for that, I needed to visit the one place Arthur would never dare to go: the bedside of his victims. The digital trail I had uncovered was a map of cold, calculating greed. But as an epidemiologist, I knew that numbers on a screen could never capture the true weight of a catastrophe. I needed to see the human cost of the Vance heritage with my own eyes, to move from the abstract world of data to the visceral reality of the pain my father had unleashed. I drove to the Harris County Medical Center, the Texas heat shimmering off the pavement like a fever dream, and stepped into the hushed, antiseptic-scented halls of the pediatric intensive care unit. The atmosphere was thick with a silence that was different from the silence of the abyss I had grown up with. This was the silence of held breaths and hushed monitors, the sound of lives suspended by a thread. In the corner of the waiting room, illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby vending machine, sat a woman whose face was etched into my earliest memories. It was Mrs. Mary, a woman who had lived 3 blocks away from the flagship restaurant for 40 years. When I was a 12-year-old girl scrubbing grease from the sidewalk, she was the only person who would stop to offer me a homemade oatmeal cookie and a kind word, treating the kitchen girl like a human being rather than a piece of equipment. I sat down next to her, my professional blazer feeling like a heavy costume. Mrs. Mary didn't recognize me at first. Why would she? The girl she knew was gone, replaced by a woman named Elena Thorne. But when I spoke her name, her tired eyes widened, and she reached out to clutch my hand with a strength that surprised me. Her palms were rough and trembling, and she smelled faintly of lavender and hospital soap. She didn't ask me about my career or why I was there. She simply pointed toward the glass partition of the isolation room where her grandson Toby lay motionless beneath a tangle of tubes and wires. Toby was only 7 years old, a boy who should have been at baseball camp, but was now fighting a battle against a microscopic predator that was systematically shutting down his kidneys. Mrs. Mary's voice was jagged as she told me they had gone to Vance's Heritage Grill to celebrate his straight-A report card. "I trusted them, Evelyn," she said, still using my old name, and the word felt like a physical blow to my chest. "I've been eating there since your father opened the first location. I thought the Vance name stood for something. I thought it was safe." The irony was a bitter, suffocating smoke in my lungs. My father had spent millions of dollars on marketing campaigns that promised family, tradition, and quality. Yet the reality was sitting right in front of me in a hospital gown. Arthur Vance's legacy wasn't a chain of successful restaurants. It was the shattered trust of a grandmother and the failing organs of a child. My internal monologue was a scathing indictment of the man I had once called Dad. He had looked me in the eye and called my concern hysterical, while Toby's blood was being filtered by a machine because of a $30 plate of brisket. I looked at Mrs. Mary's tear-streaked face and felt a shift deep within my soul. The professional distance I had maintained as a scientist dissolved, replaced by a fierce, protective maternal instinct for the community I had once been a part of. This wasn't just about epidemiology anymore. And it wasn't just about my career. It was a moral imperative. I was no longer just the invisible observer or the doctor of epidemiology. I was the only person who had the map to the bodies Arthur and Caleb were trying to hide. I stayed with Mrs. Mary for 2 hours, listening to her talk about Toby's love for dinosaurs and how he had saved up his allowance to buy his mother a birthday present. Each detail was a nail in the coffin of my hesitation. I realized that my father didn't just steal my youth. He was stealing the futures of children like Toby to pay for Caleb's sports cars and his own mahogany desks. When I finally stood up to leave, I leaned down and whispered into Mrs. Mary's ear, promising her that I would make it right. She didn't know what I meant, but I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes that was more valuable than any PhD. As I walked out of the hospital, the Texas humidity hit me like a wall, but I didn't feel the heat. I felt cold, surgical, and absolutely certain. The pain of my past and the suffering of the present had merged into a singular purpose. My father thought he had silenced me by attacking my reputation, but he had only succeeded in turning a scientist into a revolutionary. I got into my car, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in days, and looked at the digital recorder on the passenger seat. It was time to stop observing and start dismantling. The Vance heritage was a house of cards built on a foundation of lies, and I was the wind that was about to blow it all down. Friends, have you ever been in a position where doing the right thing meant hurting the people you love? It's a heartbreaking cross to bear. Seeing little Toby in that hospital bed, it changes everything, doesn't it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. How would you feel if someone you trusted betrayed that trust for money? Let me know in the comments, and please hit that like button to support Elena's courage. The drive back from the hospital was a blur of neon lights and the lingering scent of antiseptic. But inside my mind, the chaos had been replaced by a singular, frigid objective. I had seen the face of the victims. I had felt the trembling grip of a grandmother who trusted a name that was currently poisoning her grandson. The silence of the abyss that Arthur had forced upon me for 20 years was no longer a burden. It was a tactical advantage. He and Caleb were so blinded by their own self-importance, so convinced that I was just a disgruntled girl playing with useless books, that they had left the back door to their kingdom wide open. As I sat at the small laminate desk in my motel room, the blue light of my laptop reflecting in my glasses, I felt like a surgeon preparing for a life-saving procedure. My father's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He believed he had taken back the Vance name, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had actually built the digital architecture of his empire when I was just 15 years old. I pulled up the login screen for the Vance Logistics Grid, a system I had designed to track everything from beef shipments to walk-in freezer temperatures. My heart didn't race. It beat with a steady, rhythmic certainty. I typed in the administrative credentials, a password that Arthur had refused to change for 10 years because he found computer stuff tedious and beneath a man of his stature. He had always joked that nobody would ever want to steal boring numbers, never realizing that those numbers were the pulse of his business. The screen flickered, and then I was in. I was an invisible observer in the very heart of the Vance machine. I navigated past the marketing fluff and the glowing sales reports directly into the raw data logs of the North Texas Distribution Center. There it was, the receipts of their betrayal. The temperature logs for the flagship warehouse told a story of pure, unadulterated negligence. I watched the digital graph spike to 60 degrees and stay there for nearly 48 hours. The system had sent 13 automated alerts to Caleb's corporate email, each one warning that the meat was no longer safe for human consumption. I didn't just find the data, I found the reaction to it. I accessed the internal communication server and began extracting the emails Caleb had sent to the kitchen managers. My eyes narrowed as I read his words. Do not discard the shipment. Use the heavy spice rub and a vinegar wash to neutralize the odor. We cannot afford a $50,000 loss right before the gala. It was a smoking gun, written in the casual, entitlement-dripping tone of a man who thought he was untouchable. The intellectual satisfaction of this moment was profound, but it was tempered by a cold, simmering fury. While I was scrubbing floors and studying for my doctorate, Caleb was learning how to lie with a smile. My internal monologue was a sharp, mocking whisper. You thought I was the one who didn't understand the family business, Caleb. But you're the one who forgot that a business without integrity is just a crime with a logo. I moved with the precision of a scientist, downloading the original, unedited logs before they could be wiped and replaced with the fraudulent versions Arthur was currently using to prove his innocence to the press. I didn't stop at the emails. I found the purchase orders for the cheap, industrial-grade cleaning agents they were using to mask the rot, chemicals that were never intended to come into contact with food. Every click of my mouse was a nail in the coffin of the Vance heritage. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I had compiled a digital dossier that would do more than just shut down a few restaurants. It would dismantle an entire legacy. I created a digital document and titled it A Legacy of Truth, a title that felt like a quiet, final act of justice for the kitchen girl I used to be. I included the audio recording of Arthur's admission from his office, the IP logs of the smear campaign Caleb had launched against my career, and the clinical data from the hospital that linked the specific strain of E. coli to the warehouse failure. I wasn't doing this because of a childhood grudge or the sting of a missed graduation. I was doing it because Evelyn Vance was the only person who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, and Elena Thorne was the only one with the courage to dig them up. As I saved the final file, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't known in years. I had played the role of the meek daughter for the last few days, allowing Arthur to think he had broken me, while in the shadows, I was building a guillotine. He thought his wealth and his name could buy silence. But he had forgotten that you can't bribe a virus and you can't bully the truth. I looked at the countdown on my screen. The gala was only 36 hours away. Arthur was planning to stand on a stage and talk about tradition while children lay in ICU beds. He was expecting me to be at home, crying over my ruined reputation. Instead, I was preparing to give him the most memorable Thanksgiving of his life. I closed the laptop, the silence of the room no longer feeling like a void, but like the quiet before a storm. I was ready. The receipts were gathered, the weapon was loaded, and the countdown to the showdown had officially begun. The ballroom of the Vance's Heritage Grill headquarters was a cathedral of curated nostalgia, smelling of expensive hickory smoke, aged bourbon, and the heavy, sweet scent of success. It was the night of the 25th anniversary gala, and the air was electric with the chatter of Houston's elite, local politicians and media cameras capturing every gleaming smile. My father, Arthur Vance, stood at the center of the stage, his chest puffed out like a prize rooster, illuminated by the warm glow of spotlights that made his silver hair shine like a crown. Behind him, a massive banner displayed the Vance family crest, the same one I had mailed back to him in a plain envelope only months ago. To his right stood Caleb, looking every bit the pampered heir in a custom-tailored suit, holding a ceremonial golden key that was supposed to symbolize the future of the empire. Arthur's voice boomed over the high-end sound system, filled with that practiced, patronizing warmth he saved for the public. He spoke about the American dream, about building a legacy from nothing but hard work and a man's word, and about the sanctity of family that supposedly fueled every grill they operated. I stood at the back of the room, invisible in the shadows of the ornate columns, dressed in my dark blue professional blazer with my CDC identification badge pinned clearly to my lapel. I wasn't the kitchen girl tonight. I was the ghost of every lie they had ever told. As I walked down the center aisle, the clicking of my heels on the marble floor seemed to sync with the steady, cold rhythm of my heart. A few people turned to look, their conversations faltering as the sharp, clinical energy I brought into the room began to clash with the festive atmosphere. Arthur spotted me when I was halfway to the stage. I saw his eyes widen for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening on the mahogany podium, but his arrogance quickly smothered his surprise. He flashed a self-satisfied smirk at the crowd, leaning into the microphone to announce that his wandering daughter had finally returned home to pay her respects to the family heritage. He truly believed that the smear campaign and the administrative leave had broken me, that I was here to beg for his forgiveness in front of the world. "Evelyn," he chuckled, his voice echoing through the hall with a jagged, mocking edge. "I knew you couldn't stay away from the fire for long. Come up here and take your place. There's always room for a daughter who finally learns the value of her father's name." The crowd offered a polite, confused round of applause, but I didn't smile. I climbed the stairs to the stage with a calm, surgical precision that seemed to unnerve Caleb, who shifted uncomfortably and tried to hide his trembling hands behind the golden key. I didn't take the seat Arthur pointed to. Instead, I walked straight to the second microphone, the one reserved for the guest speakers. The silence of the abyss that Arthur had cultivated in our home for decades suddenly filled the entire ballroom. But this time, I was the one controlling the vacuum. I looked out at the sea of faces, the investors, the loyal customers like Mrs. Mary, and the reporters who were already sensing a different kind of story unfolding. "My name is Dr. Elena Thorne," I began, my voice clear and amplified, lacking any of the heat or hesitation Arthur expected. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the people he was preparing to betray again. "And I am not here to celebrate a name. I am here because the name Vance has become a biological hazard." A collective gasp rippled through the room, the sound of 500 people suddenly realizing the party was over. Arthur's face turned a dangerous shade of purple, his hand slamming down on the podium as he tried to cut my microphone. But I had already signaled my colleague in the tech booth. the one person Arthur had overlooked when he was firing the low-level staff. On the massive screen behind us, where a slideshow of family photos had been playing, a new image flickered into life. The unedited refrigeration logs from the Dallas warehouse, showing the temperature in the red zone for 48 consecutive hours. The emotional roller coaster hit its peak as I began to narrate the data with the cold authority of a scientist. I spoke about the 24 victims, about the specific strain of E. coli found in the heritage brisket, and about the intentional vinegar wash Caleb had used to mask the scent of rot. Arthur lunged toward me, his voice a desperate, ugly snarl as he called me a liar and a traitor. But his words were drowned out by the sudden, haunting sound that filled the room. The audio recording of him in his office, laughing about pampered academics and admitting that he knew the meat was tainted. The intense satisfaction I felt in that moment wasn't born of malice. It was the profound relief of the truth finally catching up with the man who thought he could outrun it with a marketing budget. I turned to Arthur, whose hands were now shaking so violently that he had to lean on the podium to stay upright. The golden prince, Caleb, had already dropped the ceremonial key, the heavy metal clattering onto the stage with a hollow, pathetic sound that symbolized the end of his unearned reign. I looked my father directly in the eye, the man who had told me I was nothing without his name, and I realized he was the one who was truly empty. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was clean. "You said a legacy is about a man's word, Father," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying to the back of the room. "But you forgot that the most important word is the truth. You told me I wasn't a Vance according to your standards, and you were right. I am the woman who is going to save the people you were willing to kill for a headline." I turned and walked off the stage, leaving the heritage to collapse under its own weight, as the first blue and red lights of the authorities began to flash against the ballroom windows. The flashing lights of the police cruisers outside began to paint the ballroom walls in rhythmic pulses of red and blue, a stark contrast to the warm, gold-filtered lie my father had built. Arthur stood paralyzed at the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, while the guests he had spent 25 years courting began to recoil as if the very air in the room had turned toxic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to, as the silence of the abyss that had once been my prison was now my stage. As the first 3 inspectors from the Texas Department of State Health Services stepped through the back doors, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers, I moved toward the center of the stage with a slow, deliberate grace. I could see the fine tremor in Arthur's jaw and the sweat breaking through the expensive foundation his makeup artist had applied for the cameras. Caleb, sensing the shifting tide, made a frantic, clumsy break for the side exit, but he was intercepted by a deputy before he could reach the hallway leading to the kitchens, the same kitchens where he had been planning to dump the evidence of the vinegar wash and the tainted meat. I leaned in toward my father, my voice a whisper that was surely picked up by the hot microphone still clutched in his trembling hand. I told him that the recording he just heard was only the beginning, and that I had already shared the encrypted Vance audit with every major news outlet in the state and the federal district attorney's office. The slow reveal was like watching a dam burst in slow motion as I watched the realization sink into his eyes. Not the realization of the harm he had caused Toby or Mrs. Mary, but the soul-crushing realization that the Vance name, his precious, hollow heritage, was being dismantled in front of the very people he had tried to impress. He whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, localized fury, that I was killing the family. But I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I looked at him and reminded him that he was the one who signed the purchase orders for the cheap, tainted meat, and the one who told Caleb to wash the rot away to save a few dollars. He wasn't the victim of a daughter's betrayal. He was the victim of his own unchecked arrogance. The ballroom, once a place of celebration, had transformed into a crime scene, and the catharsis I felt was a quiet, heavy weight. The satisfaction of seeing the Vance machine finally grind to a halt because it had run out of lies to grease the gears. Reporters who had come for a puff piece were now scrambling for the front row, their cameras flashing like strobe lights against Arthur's collapsing posture. Caleb was led back into the room in handcuffs, his face pale and tear-streaked, looking less like a prince and more like a frightened child who had finally been caught in a lie. My mother, Martha, stood near the stage, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting between her husband's ruin and her son's disgrace. She looked at me with a mixture of horror and a silent, desperate plea for me to make it stop. But I simply met her gaze with the cold, scientific clarity of Elena Thorne, because I had given them every chance to choose the truth. Arthur finally slumped into his chair, his head bowed as the lead health inspector began to read the emergency closure order for all 32 Vance's Heritage Grill locations. The empire of smoke and mirrors had evaporated, leaving behind only the stench of the reality they had tried to mask. I stood over him one last time, the woman who had been a useless doctor in his eyes, and now stood as the architect of his reckoning. I didn't feel hatred. I felt a profound, clinical pity for a man who believed a sign on a building was more important than the lives of the people inside it. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke the words that would echo in his mind long after the cameras stopped flashing. I told him that a legacy isn't something you buy with a marketing budget or build with the sweat of people you despise. I said, "A legacy is a living thing, Father, and yours just died of negligence." I turned my back on him for the final time, walking out of the ballroom and into the cool Houston night, the kitchen girl, finally, irrevocably free. It has been exactly 12 months since the last neon Longhorn sign was dismantled and hauled away to a salvage yard, and the world feels lighter without the shadow of my father's ego hanging over it. The bankruptcy of Vance's Heritage Grill was swift and absolute, a collapse triggered not just by the lawsuits, but by the weight of the truth that had been hidden in those kitchen floorboards for 25 years. I am sitting now in the porch of a small cottage on the Texas coast, the salt air a welcome replacement for the thick, cloying scent of hickory smoke that used to define my existence. I look at my hands. They are steady, clean, and no longer carry the phantom scent of industrial fryer grease. I am Elena Thorne, a name I have finally grown into, a name that belongs to a woman who built her own foundation on the solid ground of science and integrity. The silence that surrounds me today isn't the oppressive silence of the abyss I knew as a child. It is the quiet, restorative peace of a conscience that is finally at rest. The aftermath of the gala was a slow-motion wreck that I watched from a distance, with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. My brother Caleb is currently serving a 3-year sentence in a federal facility for his role in the conspiracy to obstruct a public health investigation and endanger lives. I think of him sometimes with a quiet, hollow pity. A boy who was given every advantage, but never taught the value of a single honest day's work. My mother, Martha, remains in the old family mansion, a place that has become a museum of failed dreams and empty rooms. She refused to see me for months, clinging to the shards of her status. But lately she has started sending short, trembling notes that ask about the weather. I don't hate her anymore. I realize she was just as much a victim of Arthur's suffocating gravity as I was, though she lacked the strength to break orbit. As for Arthur Vance, he is a shadow of the man who once barked orders from a mahogany throne. He lost the money, the cars, and the heritage, but more importantly, he lost the audience for his lies. I hear he spends his days in a quiet retirement community, complaining to anyone who will listen about the way things used to be. But no one is listening anymore. I didn't keep the money from the defamation lawsuit my father tried to file against me before the evidence buried him. Instead, I used every cent of that settlement to establish the Thorne Foundation for Food Protection. It is a small, focused organization that provides training and resources for small, independent restaurants to ensure they never have to choose between their margins and their customers' lives. This is my version of the American dream, not a monument to my own vanity, but a commitment to the responsibility we have toward one another. My father used to say that nothing came from books, but it was my education that allowed me to save the lives he was willing to throw away. I have learned that a true legacy isn't written in neon or carved into wood. It is etched into the health and safety of the people we serve. I have finally fulfilled my primary duty, not as a Vance, but as a human being who understood that silence in the face of rot is its own kind of poison. The sun is beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft, healing amber light across the water, and I feel a profound sense of rebirth. I reached into the pocket of my linen cardigan and pulled out a small, crinkled envelope that arrived in the mail this morning. It was a card from Mrs. Mary, decorated with bright, hand-drawn dinosaurs that could only be the work of a child. I opened it, and the words inside made the last 2 years of struggle feel worth every second of the pain. "Toby is home," she wrote, her handwriting steadier than the last time I saw her. "He had his first baseball practice yesterday. He told me to tell the doctor lady that he hit a home run for her. Thank you, Elena Thorne, for giving us back our future." I stood up and walked toward the water's edge, the waves gently lapping at my feet, and I realized that Toby's home run was the only heritage I ever truly needed. I am no longer the kitchen girl scrubbing away the evidence of a man's greed. I am the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. What a journey with Elena. As I was telling this story, I couldn't help but think about how often our skills are dismissed by the people who should support us the most. Elena didn't just take down a corrupt business. She took back her power from a father who never saw her worth. To all of you listening, remember this. Your worthless passion or your unseen hard work is your greatest weapon. Don't let anyone, not even family, tell you that your education or your integrity is less important than a bank account. A true legacy isn't built on bricks and mortar. It's built on the lives we touch and the truth we uphold. How did Elena's choice make you feel? Would you have the strength to do what she did? And what does legacy mean to you in your own life? Please share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for being here with me at Rose Revenge. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.